Can Boeing Starliner astronauts vote from the ISS? In November, eligible U.S. voters will go to the polls to cast their vote for the general election, including for president, which happens here once every 4 years. But what about the astronauts on the ISS? They won't be able to go to their local polling place to cast their vote. Let's break down the issue of whether Boeing Starliner astronauts Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams can vote from space. ISS astronauts legally can vote from space station, but because Butch and Suni had a mission extension, they didn't file a necessary piece of paperwork before they left. But I have the direct word in an email from NASA telling me the definitive answer to this question. I am Swapna Krishna, and today on Ad Astra, we're going to talk about voting from space. If you want to know what is going on at this point with Boeing Starliner, I have an in-depth video about that you should check out. But let me give you the quick summary. Butch and Suni will return in February 2025 aboard SpaceX's Crew Dragon. Boeing Starliner is scheduled for an autonomous undocking and re-entry to Earth on September 6th at 6:04 p.m. Eastern Time. It will take about 6 hours for undocking, deorbit, re-entry, and touchdown at White Sands. Crew 9 is currently scheduled for launch no earlier than September 24th. And it's important to note that this will not be delayed by recent events, specifically the grounding of the SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket. The FAA grounded the Falcon 9 after a first stage booster failed its landing. It was a routine Starlink mission, and the booster landed, as always, on the drone ship. But then it tipped over as visible flames billowed from the rocket's base. The FAA launches routine mishap investigations after any problems with a mission profile, so the rocket was grounded. But just for 2 days. The FAA announced yesterday that the Falcon 9 would be able to return to flight, and SpaceX has already had 2 successful launches just 65 minutes apart in the early hours of August 31st. And also, NASA announced this week that the 2 crew members of Crew 9 would be NASA astronaut Nick Hague and Roscosmos cosmonaut Alexander Gorbanov, and Butch and Suni will assume the other 2 crew members' duties for the 6-month-long mission. The 2 astronauts pulled off the flight were women, Zena Cardman and Stephanie Wilson. So NASA's probably going to take some heat for this, but it actually does make sense. NASA has a deal with Russia to fly an integrated crew. NASA astronaut Tracy Caldwell Dyson is currently part of the Soyuz crew on the ISS right now. So it was easy to guess that the cosmonaut would stay on the crew. And adjusting from a 4-person crew at launch to a 2-person crew this close to the launch date is not easy, and Nick Hague has the most experience with spaceflight. It's not ideal, but it makes sense, and it is what it is. So that's where we are with Boeing Starliner. Now, let's talk about how astronauts vote from the ISS. In 1997, Texas passed a law that allowed astronauts to vote from space. NASA's astronaut program is based at Johnson Space Center in Houston, so that's where the astronauts live and work, and where most of them are registered to vote. Some astronauts are registered to vote elsewhere, and NASA has worked with their local county election offices as well. It's also important to note that astronauts can also submit an absentee ballot, voting before they leave if time allows, but normal ISS missions are around 6 months in length, and if you've ever voted absentee, you probably know that an absentee ballot usually isn't available 6 months before an election. It sounds simple, right? That should cover it. That law tells us what we need to know. Well, it's actually more complicated than it seems. Let's go through the history. In 1996, NASA astronaut John Blaha was serving aboard the Russian space station Mir, and he requested permission to vote in the 1996 presidential election. NASA made the plan for Blaha to vote electronically from space, but the Texas Secretary of State put a stop to it because there was no provision in Texas law to vote from space. But the next year, then Governor of Texas, George W. Bush, signed a law allowing astronauts to vote from space. It was first put into practice in 1997 by David Wolf, also a board member, to vote in local Houston elections. But here is where it gets complicated for Butch and Suni. In order to vote from space, astronauts have to fill out what's called a federal postcard application. It's basically the same application that members of the military have to file to vote overseas. This is the tricky part though. For astronauts, it has to be submitted on the ground before departure. And it is likely Butch and Suni did not go through this process because they didn't know they'd be in space come November 5th, which is the date of the general election. The way it works is NASA astronauts usually fill out the FCPA before they launch, and it is approved by their local county election office. Once that happens, the county clerk sends a test ballot to Johnson Space Center in order to confirm it can be filled out on space station computers. Once that is confirmed, NASA uplinks a secure electronic ballot to the ISS. The county clerk sends specific credentials to each crew member's emails so they can access the secure ballot. The question was basically whether the Boeing Starliner crew members, though at that point they will be SpaceX Crew 9 crew members, would be given these secure credentials by the county clerk's office since they did not fill out that FPCA before they launched. After the astronaut on the ISS completes their ballot, it's sent back to NASA through the Near Space Network, which is managed out of NASA Goddard in Maryland. It goes through a Tracking and Data Relay Satellite, or TDRS, to White Sands Complex in New Mexico. Yes, the same White Sands that Boeing Starliner will land at. White Sands then transfers the completed secure ballots back to NASA Johnson Space Center. Finally, it is sent to the county clerk, who is the only one besides the astronauts with the password to decrypt the ballot. So then, I've given you all this history, but can Butch and Suni vote from the ISS? The answer, a resounding yes. NASA confirmed for me via email yesterday that they have confirmed with the county clerk that all U.S. astronauts on the ISS, including Butch and Suni, will be able to vote in November's election. If you're wondering, the Russian cosmonauts also can vote from space. In 1971, the Soyuz 11 crew were the first cosmonauts to vote from space. Yes, we have been using the Soyuz for that long. It's part of why it's considered so reliable. It has an incredibly long track record and is old, well-known, flight-proven tech. In the 1989 Soviet parliamentary elections, the cosmonauts didn't vote secretly and actually just spoke their votes to ground control. The historic 1989 Soviet Union elections were the first where citizens could vote for candidates other than those in the Communist Party and resulted in the election of President Boris Yeltsin. But now on the ISS, the cosmonauts generally vote by proxy through the Cosmonaut Training Center. But back to NASA and my original question. This is really good news for Butch and Suni and a relief because it would have been very disappointing if the astronauts were not able to vote simply due to a mission extension. And that is about all I have to tell you about voting from space. Thank you for watching. I'm Swapna Krishna, and this is Ad Astra.